speaker is going to be Marjorie Ngwenya, is going to give us a motivational talk. The amazing Marjorie Ngwenya is a fellow of the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries. She qualified in 2006. She has also served as the first president of the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries to be based outside of the UK. She is also the youngest president, the third female, and the first person of color to have held this role. Currently, she serves as a non-executive director on a number of boards in insurance and also non-profit sectors in South Africa. Marjorie, thank you for joining us today. So Marjorie, over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you for inviting me to speak with you and to share with my experiences. I'm going to talk for less than 20 minutes, and then I'm hoping that there will be some Q&A to engage with as well. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Great. So as mentioned, at this stage in my life, I'm mostly a non-executive director and partly a leadership coach. And I say at this stage because there will no doubt be another chapter to my career. So I'm working with people, and that's always been part of my story. And better still, I'm working with people to bring to life their self-awakening. And I'm also learning a lot in the process. I'm also writing, which brings me a lot of joy. I love languages, so I'm in the process of learning my 5th language, which is Spanish, and that's my brain cells active. So let me start by telling you a little bit about myself. My childhood was pretty textbook. I was born in the UK and raised in a vibrant post-independent Zimbabwe. And ours was the Southern African ideal. I went to a good school, I had good grades, I came from a decent home, lots of chores, outdoors playtime. I was a bit of a tomboy, so climbing trees was for me. And I grew up in a city called Gweru in the middle of Zimbabwe. And believe me, when they say city, it's a stretch of the imagination. It's a small community where everyone's families are connected. And if you misbehave, then your parents get to know about it before they get home in the evening. So you get punished at school, possibly get punished by your community, and then you get punished by your parents when they arrive home. So it was a pretty sheltered upbringing. And in that sheltering, there were layers of blindfolds that I didn't realize I was carrying or I was wearing until I was much older. So for example, I had internalized my father, the corporate guy, and I took that to be what everyone aspired to become when they got older. I was raised in Christian schools where questioning your faith was a dismissible offense. I was surrounded by stereotypes of women who took the back seat while the men led. I was raised in a world where you didn't do anything really to draw attention to yourself. You just tried to fit in. I was a pretty feisty kid though, and I had my moments of protest. I was really not a fan of history in my early teens, and I couldn't see the point of memorizing information. So I lobbied my father at some point and I said, please, can I drop history as a subject? I don't understand why I have to study this. And he wasn't interested in my reasoning. In his version of the story, apparently I signed a document with his signature. I forged his signature to get out of history. My version of the story, of course, is very different. But nonetheless, he wasn't having any of it and I had to continue. But then a couple of years later, in 6th form, I decided that I was going to study French, maths, and physics for my A-level subjects. And in our household, I may as well have said, I'm going to join the army. It really didn't go down well. So I had to quickly add chemistry to the mix because the minimum subjects were 3. And my dad was adamant that I was going to do science subjects. But I was too defiant to not do French. So I ended up adding a 4th subject to my workload. My parents were pretty tough about education and they were determined that their children would follow professions. They didn't really care which, as long as it was a profession. And I was good at maths, so I was inclined towards the STEM careers. And they were very adamant that I would follow something that would be a good profession, have good earning potential in future. And so When I said to them, what about a career in languages? That really wasn't an option for them. And that's a great irony because my father and I later both served as translators for the British government many years later. But nonetheless, when I was 17, I took part in this Maths Olympiad competition that was sponsored by Old Mutual. And that's when I first heard about the actuarial profession. I'd ruled out accounting because it sounded a little boring, and no offense to any aspiring accountants here, but that was the world through the eyes of a 17-year-old. I ruled out medicine after I'd done a week of rounds at a local hospital. And my older sister was going into medicine, and I thought, no, I've spent too long walking in her footsteps. I'm going to do something different. But the actuarial thing, that was very exciting because apparently there were only 5 qualified actuaries in Zimbabwe at the time. And the grown-ups spoke of it with reverence. It was this impossible career, these very difficult exams. So I said to myself, that's the career I want to pursue. I want something that's going to challenge me intellectually and be rewarding. So I got accepted to study actuarial science at the London School of Economics. And I had no idea back then how great that was. So 4 days after my last A-level exam, I packed my bags and moved to the UK. And I said to my parents, I'm going home. And after a few months on the other side, it was clear that home was really the place that I'd left behind. So 6 months into my adventure in London, the Zimbabwean economy was in turmoil. And many of you will know the story of Zimbabwe. Many of you, I believe, are from Zimbabwe. And my fees were doubling every day as the currency went into free fall. And the long story short is I had to leave university if my parents had any chance of funding my siblings. So I'm one of 6 children, and I'm third in line to the throne. So I have younger siblings who would have come after me and not been able to study if my parents had spent all their resources on my studies. And of course, as I mentioned, my parents were very adamant about education. So we had huge fights about this decision because I was essentially telling them that they couldn't help me. And for people who held education in such high esteem, this was an issue. So they thought, here she goes again, she's being defiant as usual. But eventually, time revealed that that was the best thing that I could have done. So I took a job with Deloitte in London and I started working as a tax associate. And a few months in, I was approached by my manager who asked me whether I knew there was an actuarial team in-house. And she asked me, would I be keen to move? And I said, yeah, of course I am. So I was wrapping up my tax exams at the time and I was interviewing with the actuarial department and they said to me, we've never taken on anyone who doesn't have an undergraduate degree. So our concern is that you won't pass the exams. What we'd like to understand is, or what we'd like to agree between us is if you don't pass the exams, you don't have a job. So that made me work extremely hard to pass the exams. And while my peers were very relaxed about it, I took it so seriously. And I even took my books on holiday with me. That's how determined I was to pass. So for me, it was a case of great challenge accepted. And with a stumble here and there, I qualified 5 years later. And in the meantime, I'd taken on secondments in the Netherlands and in Canada. And while I had the same fellowship qualification as my peers, for a while it bothered me that I didn't have the same background. I didn't have a degree, and I thought at the time that was a disadvantage. In all honesty, it turned out not to matter once I'd passed my exams. But it's interesting how perspectives can change because later I realized that I actually had an advantage on my colleagues. I was younger than most of them. I'd learned responsibility at an earlier age, and it progressed my career a little quicker because I hadn't spent those 3 years studying in university. And as I mentioned, once you're qualified, nobody really cares what came before it. So in terms of my actuarial career, I started in pensions at Deloitte, and then that opened my eyes in terms of what actuarial science was. I remember when the penny dropped, saying to my manager that we're really just people who make educated guesses. And she's like, yeah, That's it. That's exactly what our work is. So I wanted to do something that was a little bit more relatable because pensions for me just seemed so abstract. So I moved into insurance and I was working at Gen Re at the time. And I found that I really enjoyed client-facing work. So I was doing a pricing and product management role, and I was visiting clients to renegotiate treaties. And that really motivated me. I actually returned to Deloitte, and this time I was on the life insurance side. And it had always been a dream of mine to work internationally. So I was really fortunate for the opportunity to do that with them. I then went into risk management at Swiss Re. And back then, risk management was an emerging area of practice for actuaries. And again, I really enjoyed the international nature of the role and the interaction with people. So my job was reviewing what are called terms of trade. So these are the pricing principles, essentially, for all of our business units globally, and ensuring that they were managing the risks that the company would be exposed to. So things like mispricing or ending up being uncompetitive. After that, I led a consulting department as a director at an audit firm. And then I decided to spend a year at business school. And the reason for that was I wanted to do some kind of studies that were not actuarial. I wanted to broaden my perspective. Ended up doing a master's in leadership and strategy. After that, I moved to South Africa, where I became the chief risk officer for Old Mutual Africa. And that gave me both a broad and a deep view of risk work. And then I moved into a chief strategist role at Liberty before I took on the presidency of the IFOA and started to be a freelancer. So as many of you will know, volunteering for the profession was a huge part of my life, and it's been a 15-year journey. And you can only imagine how much of an honor it was for me to become the youngest president and the first president of color. This was a profession that I'd grown up in and seen older, mostly male professionals and all white achieve that role. So I didn't believe that it was possible. So for a start, my journey onto the council had been pretty unlikely. In the same way that the presidents had looked a certain way, so did council members for the most part. It's very different nowadays, and a lot has changed. So back in 2010, I spoke to the then president, Ronnie Bowie, and I told him that I was going to be stepping down as editor of the Actuary magazine. And I said to him, I want to contribute to the profession in a different way. And I'm considering joining council, but I said to him, people like me don't stand a chance. And he said, well, if people like you don't put yourselves forward, how's it ever going to change? And he was right. I put myself forward and I was elected. So with the IFOA, presidents are typically nominated from inside the council. So council members nominate one another for that leadership role. And on occasion, they invite someone on the outside to take on the role. And when that happens, the chair of the nominations committee will call council members and say, are you in support of us co-opting this external candidate? And they'll describe a bit about them. So for a couple of years, I've been receiving these calls from the chair of the nominations committee. And then just before Christmas in 2015, I received a call, a similar call, and that's what I thought it would be about. And he said to me, well, your colleagues have nominated you. Would you like to take up the nomination? And I was shell-shocked, could not imagine a phone call like that. And I asked him for some time because I just really wasn't expecting it. I couldn't decide on the spot. And so I took a couple of weeks over the Christmas holidays because it implied a lot about my professional career, therefore. And I came back and I said, yes, I'm willing to take up that nomination. So I wish I could say that there was a formula that I applied. I'd been a council member for nearly 5 years at that point when the nomination came. So I suppose that my colleagues saw in me qualities that aligned with that position. And I'd been pretty vocal, but it hadn't crossed my mind that it would happen to me at that stage. It was typically something that happens at the end of one's career. So in 160 years of the institution's history, there hadn't been somebody aged under 40. There had never been a person of color, or indeed somebody who wasn't based in the UK. And I was the third woman. So I was already living in South Africa at the time, and the idea was so far away from my imagination. But it came at a time when I was making a transition towards attaining more fulfillment in my life. And I have to say that really wasn't the shape that I'd expected. So I had to turn down what I thought would have been my career pinnacles. I turned down a position for a CEO role. And that's not something I imagined I would ever have done. But nonetheless, I think that having been open to hearing others' views, having demonstrated a care for the profession and its success, is what allowed my peers to have confidence in me. And it wasn't all glorious. It is, without doubt, one of the toughest positions I've ever held. At the time, we were instituting a lot of change, and I had to make the case for a lot of that change. And you're never popular when you're in that position. So you have to put all of that aside and do what's right for the organization. And I was encouraged to build on what my presidents before had done and what presidents today are continuing to do. But it took a personal toll to be driving such wholesale change with a lot of resistance and a lot of interpersonal dynamics. So you can imagine the system that I described. And now you have a young woman of color trying to lead that change and asking for things to be different. So some of my toughest lessons about leadership and the human disposition were learned in that position. But more about that another day. So perhaps a thought to leave with you around the power of intention. In 2016, I was at Liberty and I was already president-elect at the time, and I was doing some coaching. So our CEO had said that he wanted his entire exco to go through these sessions to understand what our personal and professional aspirations were so that he could get some understanding and alignment. It turns out that this conversation was one of my turning points for my decision to leave the corporate sphere, but nonetheless, it really got me to think about what I was doing with my life. And one of the exercises I was asked to do was to write my eulogy. And this is where you essentially imagine that your life has come to an end and someone is reading a speech about you, and what would they say? And this really gets you to think about, what is my contribution on this earth? And I thought I was being very clever because I said to the coach, well, I did this exercise at business school 3 years ago. So I'm just going to go and dig out that document. I'm going to see what's changed, and then I'm going to refresh it, and then I'll share that with you. I was taking a shortcut. To my great surprise, I had no recollection, by the way, of what I'd written in that document. I just knew that I'd had to do it as an assignment, and that's how I'd seen it. Wow. When I opened it, there was a line in there about Marjorie served as president prior to her retirement. I'd written it down. I'd put the intention into the universe. I'd not thought about it after that actively, but clearly somewhere in my subconscious, I had aligned myself to that possibility. So this was my lesson about things that we aspire to, and if we want them, we should speak them. So to wrap up, some qualities that I think have helped me in my career to date. The first would be continuous learning and curiosity. You are never done with learning. And you might think that you've achieved career success and that you've learned all the skills that you need to thrive. It's never true. There is always something you can continue to learn and improve about yourself. The second is about having people skills and building your networks. And I can't emphasize this enough. This has been pivotal in my own career. I attribute many of my opportunities to having been connected to people who were able to facilitate conversations that ended up in something positive. So nurture your networks as much as you can. Third is to have the courage to try new things and to knock on doors that present themselves to you. You never know what's hiding behind them. So if you walk away from them, you won't find out. The fourth is determination. There are lots of hardships that I've endured which have become triumphs in my life. So when you're in the midst of something difficult, don't see that as the end. Try to find the lesson in it. And believe me, the sun will shine one day. And lastly, to keep looking at the big picture and to be mindful of context. So learning to focus, or learning what to focus on by asking yourself, does it really matter in the grand scheme of things? So having a bad day and failing an exam might seem like a disaster at the time, but does it matter in the grand scheme of things if you can pick yourself up and pass 2 exams in the following year? So in closing, I really appreciate your invitation. And once again, I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have. I see your question that says, what was the biggest failure that you endured in your career? So the thing for me is that I do not perceive things as failures, and I do not hold on to a sense of regret. Everything that I have encountered in my career, while challenging, has ended up helping me in some way. So I feel that if I regret things or if I consider them failures, then I don't learn from them. And negative emotions drain us exceptionally. So I try not to cling to them. So perhaps challenges that I've had rather than failures. I had a very tough time when I was towards the end of my examinations. There was a year where I did not pass a single exam and I was really down. And this is where I learned the big picture idea, because I had come into the profession without an undergraduate degree. So I had to bridge the gap between my A-levels and this professional material myself. And I wasn't giving myself credit for how hard that was. But I got to a point where I was so impatient to pass, so impatient to qualify, that when I hit these stumbling blocks, I thought it was the end of the world. And I thought, oh, I'm just going to give up now. I'm 4 years into my studies, and this is just soul destroying. But the reality was, at that time, I was probably 3/4 through the exams in a space of 3 years. And that year just gave me time to catch up with myself. And it gave me time to humble myself and apply my time better, and to not being so, I suppose, overconfident about what I was able to achieve, because I was juggling, I was really aggressive with my promotions and with my workload, and I was trying to qualify at the same time, and something had to give. So I would say that was probably one of the earlier career lessons that I had to learn, is to pace myself and to be realistic about what I could achieve. Okay, Chadwick says, what is your favorite part of the actuarial career on a day-to-day? What makes you enjoy your work? Good question. So my favorite part is probably dealing with people, which is something entirely non-actuarial or non-specific to actuarial work, but I enjoy being able to add value. I like to be able to solve problems and to offer clients solutions to those challenges. So being able to take a complex subject and break it down into something that even a young child could understand, or a school-going child could understand, is very satisfying to me, because I think a lot of our work can be quite technical and quite difficult for people outside of the profession to understand. And one of the skills that you'll learn as you work in businesses is making that relevant to the situation you're in. So it's one thing to have a great understanding of technical concepts and mathematics, but that's meaningless if you can't make it relevant to a commercial context, or if you can't simplify the concept so that business leaders can understand it. So that's probably one of my most enjoyable activities. Amanda says, what do you want to be remembered as? I want to be remembered as somebody who was able to add value to people's lives, whether that's professionally or personally. So I take my roles in both those domains very seriously. I want to apply myself and be known for quality and delivery, reliability and excellence. And so I am a very, very staunch super auntie. I have 11 nephews and nieces, and I take that job very seriously as seriously as I take my role as a daughter, as a sister, as a friend. I want my life to represent balance. So for me, it's not all about professional achievements and chasing titles and status. I am very, very relationship driven. So that's what I stand for. Livoni says, what is the future of the actual profession in 4IR? So varied, I would say. By the way, I think any profession is in danger with the advent of 4IR. So what that means for all of us is updating our skill sets and remaining relevant. So for example, actuaries who qualified around the time that I did have had to keep their skills up to date and to learn about things like data science and machine learning. Now, not everyone will understand those things in detail, but as long as they understand how they impact the work that they're doing and how the industries that they're working in are affected by that, then that will keep them modern. So I think that much of our work is going to be replicated or possible with automation, so that actuaries might be needed, or few actuaries might be needed to code these machines. But some of the work that I will have done as an actuarial student is no longer relevant in today's world because it's already pre-programmed. So what we're going to need to be good at is understanding context and understanding commercial challenges and understanding how to problem solve in specific industries rather than being able to use calculators or computers. So for me, that's the kind of the balance is shifting from technical knowledge to more value-adding capability. I see Daniel, knowing what you know now, and if you can start again just after finishing A-levels, would you do it again, the actual qualification? Yes, I think I would do it again. It was very challenging. And as I mentioned, there were moments where I thought about giving up, but I would do it again. Perhaps the only thing that I would reconsider is, do I need to be a fellow? So I heard Daniel earlier talking about being an associate, and I think that certainly in today's world, where fellowship typically represents the ability to sign something in a regulatory capacity, I've never really used my fellowship. And I studied the health fellowship, and I've barely worked in health. If I'd been an associate with relevant experience, I think that I might have done similar things with my life. So I have no regrets about the path that I followed. If I could make a tweak, perhaps that's the thing I would consider, is being an associate rather than a fellow. And then I see Leroy's question, is it still possible to get work before finishing college? It depends on the employer. I think it's extremely challenging to do so. And particularly in a world where you've got so many actuarial science graduates and employers are looking for demonstration of capability. And they do that by seeing your university scores. They want the confidence of knowing that you're going to be able to pass the exams and that they can invest in you. And I was fortunate that I was already working in a firm where I had some kind of track record. So my manager could vouch for me and say, she's a hard worker. I was already taking my tax exams and I passed those. And that was further demonstration that I was able to juggle my work and my studies. So if you were working for a company already and you hadn't finished, so you say you were doing an internship and you demonstrated an ability to pass your exams, and for whatever reason you couldn't finish your degree, you probably have a better chance of succeeding in that conversation than you would going to an employer straight and saying, take me on, I have no degree. I think, yeah, the chances are slim nowadays.
Thank you, Marjorie, for taking your time to speak to us. And also thank you to everyone for the wonderful questions.